Yeah, so we're applying computational phylogenetic methods and evaluation of the Dene-Yenisian hypothesis. This is familiar. I should just thank Ben Potter for some of the background maps that I'm going to be using here, and just note that that we've had EPSCoR funding for this, which is funded to have a math student in the lab to help us. So the Dene-Yenisian hypothesis, poses several questions about the origin of geographic dispersal for the language family, and that being really these three hypotheses that have emergence out of Central Asia, out of Beringia, or out of North America, and we're going to talk about the first two of these. And these three hypotheses have been suggested by several people, including Comrie, Fortescue, Scott, and Donahue. So we're testing, like I said, the first two of these using linguistic phylogenetics. Particularly, we're doing neighbor net analysis through a program called SplitsTree, and Bayesian analysis through a program called Mr. Bayes. So on the hypothesis, several people, including Lyle Campbell and Jared Diamond, have suggested using alternative methods to test the hypothesis. So we're using computational phylogenetics. The bioinformatic methods of computational phylogenetics have been revolutionizing evolutionary biology in the last 10 years or so, maybe a little longer. And really, within the last few years, we've seen more application of this in evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary linguistics. We're using neighbor joining distance measures. We're going to be presenting the two methods that we're presenting today. One of which is doing network modeling. The other was evaluating trees against the data, and so evaluating the number of trees and then testing the fit of those against the data set that we've put in. These methods have been claimed to be able to push the time depths in which historical linguistics is applicable to questions of prehistory. So for instance, Gray and Atkinson in 2003 argued for this Anatolian theory of Indo-European origins, and pushing the time depth for Indo-European back over 1,000 years, close to 2,000 years than previously thought. Dunn et al. In 2005 argued for phylogenetic relationships of Papuan across Sewell, the continent, the late Pleistocene continent that would have included New Guinea and Australia. Dunn et al. Particularly is interesting, useful for us because they were innovating the use of typological data for looking at phylogenetic structure. And as many linguists will know, that typological data has for a long time been used to look at linguistic areas, types of features that are borrowed. Dunn et al. Argued that you could also see phylogenetic structure from typological data. And what they argued for was that the relationships that they were proposing would have been pushed back to this time depth in the terminal Pleistocene when there was a single continent. So Papuan across Sewell, the use of typological data there is necessary because Papuan has basically an absence of cognate sets. The idea is that the time depth is such that there aren't cognates that can be discovered, and so they turned to typological data. They argued if what they were seeing was a phylogenetic signal that was beyond the current temporal ceiling, that there was hope to kind of open up long-range comparison between other of the isolates and families of the world. Now with Dene and Yeniseian, there are also relatively few Dene-Yenisian cognates. And Vajda has identified a number of these, but in the picture of reconstructing a linguistic family or posing a relationship, there's still rather few. Within Na-Dene, the situation is kind of different. There's an overabundance of, or at least an abundance of close cognates in Na-Dene, which make the family look a lot younger linguistically than the archaeological record seems to indicate. That the the families have been present here, in Alaska, for instance. And then I think this is actually 73, but that there's inconsistency among the isoglosses in northern Athabascan, for instance, where you don't see clear groupings, but you have isoglosses kind of pointing in multiple relationships. And so, like the Sol case, we're of course dealing with this scenario where we have a terminal Pleistocene land bridge. So we're presenting data from two data sets. One is the typological data, in which we've coded a matrix of 116 characters, which are phonological characters, so things about the sound system, the organization of the vowel space, for instance, and then morphological data, so noun morphology, verb morphology, and the functions that are coded with the different morphemes. And we've done this across 40 languages, across Athabascan, and 2 Yeniseian languages for Ket and Kot. The lexical cognate data, this is the, we just got some of this out yesterday, so it's rather new things that we're presenting here. Have 192 lexical characters coded into cognate classes, and we did this for 16 languages, and so so we're hoping to really build this up in the near future, but this is, in a sense, new work and work in progress that we're presenting. So NeighborNet is an agglomerate clustering algorithm. It constructs a splits graph by iteratively combining taxa clusters given the agreement-disagreement. And here is the NeighborNet for Dene and Yeniseian in our data. And so the groupings themselves are easier to see if I kind of group them like that. And so we do see a lot of clustering in the data. And if I put up this next slide, then we see one major split within the graph between what are all the coastal languages, basically, and then the interior languages on the left. So we have coastal Athabascan with a northern group and a southern group, and then Eyak and Tlingit and Haida, and we put Haida in there to kind of see where it falls out, knowing that it's been considered outside of the family, and it's consistently outside of the family in these data. Ket and Kot are they've also consistently fallen within this kind of coastal Athabascan area of the network. On the other side, in the interior, we have basically what looks like 2 groupings that run between Alaska and Canada, South and West Alaska group, and then the Plains Apachean group. And so you can see here that from known groupings like Plains Apachean and the coastal Athabascan group and such, that we're seeing higher order structure within the from the typological data. So I've taken the shading from the previous slide and then plotted them geographically on this slide here over this map, and so you can see we have the coastal series here, coastal Athabascan, Eyak, Tlingit, and then Yeniseian, which was grouped within that half of the graph. Haida's sitting out by itself, of course. This was that first chain from Alaska to Canada that I showed, and this is the second chain, South and West Alaska, and then the Plains Apachean group here. Okay, so that was the NeighborNet. The next method that we're looking at here is the Bayesian analysis. This is like maximum likelihood, except that it's more economical in that you're not trying to sample exhaustively the possibility space, but you are randomly sampling it in a way that is representative. So you're sampling the possible trees. We did a long run on the data, which, well, it's not that long of a run in terms of how long these runs can be. It was about 12 or 13 hours, and we generated about 150,000 trees. Given we threw out about the first quarter of those as the algorithm runs. it converges towards the higher probabilities. And so we sampled about 100,000 trees in the end. And then we constructed consensus trees using two ways of constructing trees. The majority rules way looks at, it puts within the tree any splits that occurred more than 50% of the time out of the trees that were sampled. And then the greedy consensus trees doesn't have that threshold. It kind of forces splits all along and you end up with a bifurcating tree. And so here is for the 40 languages that we sampled, the tree diagram, and this is just a circular view of it because there's so many taxa that we, in order to fit it in the slide, I put it like this. You could just hang it out like a more traditional tree. In order to make the groupings, I think, a little bit clearer, I've shaded these and using the same colors that I was shading in the neighbor net. Okay. So we do see a coastal Athabascan group of which Ket and Kot are being grouped with. This Alaska-Canada 1 chain, you can see the Alaska-Canada 2 chain as well. Plains Apachean here in the green, the South and West Alaska, and then the Canada group. But one of the differences here is that the Canada group kind of stands out more within this within these trees than it did in the neighbor net, although they were still grouped close together. So that was the majority rules tree, and this is the greedy tree in a sense, and you can see that this is bifurcating. It's forced splits in the data, even if they've had rather low probability, like 25% of the trees that were sampled. And here you can see the groupings again that we have. So some things about both with the neighbor net and with the Bayesian analysis. One of the things we're finding is that Tlingit, for example, is consistently outside of where Ket, and Ket is coming in closer to Athabascan. In these, the known groupings themselves are coming out of the data. Okay, and these are again the groupings. You see some more structure. So, for instance, Dene and Atna are coming in together here.
Can everybody see where the Yeniseian languages are in that?
Yeah, I can probably.
Can they see that from back there?
This? Yeah. So here are the Yeniseian languages. This is Ket and Kot, and you can see that it's got a 1 here. Ket and Kot were grouped together 100% of the time.
What does it have to do with Wailocky?
It's a question for you to answer.
Yeah. So it's a closer relationship with the Californians.
So the implications for the typological data. So one is that that looking at known groupings, phylogenetic structure is coming out of the typological data. So we're seeing this higher order tree structure in here. For the prehistory of Na-Dene, the coastal languages are in a sense being grouped, including Yeniseian here, indicating a coastal dispersal or suggesting that hypothesis has some support here. With the interior, we see 2 chains going to Alaska and Canada, and South and West Alaska groupings, and then Plains Apachean stands out again on its own. On the question of what is the prehistory of Dene and Yeniseian, testing these 2 hypotheses, the out of Central Asia across Beringia or out of Beringia to Central Asia, just using 2 kind of modes of reasoning. One, I would say, weaker than the other. Given the geographic center of the major splits in the tree topology, following suggestions by about a century ago by Sapir, that is a reason to hypothesize the center of a radiation event, whether that be a biological species diversification or linguistic diversification. And the stronger argument is that of the phylogenetic hierarchies, that Tlingit was consistently outside of Yeniseian and Athabascan for this typological data set. Really showing this pattern of perhaps diversification after Tlingit or around the same time as Tlingit, and a radiation event. and then kind of a slow and long and heavy contact in, related diversification for the interior Athabascan languages. And so I'm going to turn this over to Gary, who's going to discuss the lexical data set now.
How long are we going
You're
to?
right on time, 15 minutes, 15 minutes.
Does that include questions or?
No, that includes questions.
Okay, so I'll try to be, oh, you got to watch it, okay. I'll try to be quick here. So what Mark just showed you was one type of data, using typological characters, using information that doesn't presume any sort of relatedness. We wanted to do the same sort of analysis using the same sort of computational methodology, but apply it to a different type of data to see just whether we get the similar sort of results. So what we did is look at lexical data. We took a 200-item basic vocabulary list, essentially a modified Swadesh list, modified to include things that are relevant to the north, like moose and birch and things like that. And we coded this into cognate classes the best we could, understanding which things are cognate. Not always easy to do, but we are dealing with we're presuming genetic relatedness here. And we do have some resources, including Jeff Lear's work on Athabascan Tlingit and Vajda's paper on Dene-Yenisian cognates, so we can make some presumptions about what the cognate classes are. Crucially here, we're interested not just in reconstruction, we're interested more in what you might think of traditionally as a subgrouping approach. We want to know not just what's cognate and what reconstructs, but what are the other classes, the things that don't reconstruct, because we want to see what sort of changes happened. And in particular, we're not so interested in things that are cognate all the way across Dene-Yenisian. That's not going to tell us anything, right? Because there's no information to tell us what changes have occurred there. The interesting things are the things where we get multiple cognate classes and can tell us something about how the languages grew. So we did the same sort of thing. And unfortunately, these pictures are a little harder to see because I didn't make the labels as large. But we did the same sort of thing. We applied a neighbor net analysis and then also a Bayesian analysis to search for trees. In a network analysis, what we find is a grouping like this that we see some of the similar groupings that you saw looking at typological characters, but you see an isolation of cat and Tlingit with very long branch lengths. Now this is using a type of measurement that tends to group things together that have particularly long branches, that things that are the most different, the most dissimilar. In other words, have the most lexical characters which are different. So we also looked at this using a different sort of distance method known as Dalo distances, essentially a logarithmic approach, and we get a somewhat different result here, where you see some of the similar groupings in here that we did before, but Tlingit and Ket then separated quite far. But crucially, both still very different, and showing very different than the other languages. That is, you can interpret the branch lengths as measurement of difference, the number of difference in the lexical characters, the number of words that are different, if you will. EAC is not included in this data set. I should say one thing about the data set. This is very much a work in progress. We only have 16 languages coded here, compared to 40 in the other set. So in particular, we have very few representatives outside the core Northern Athabascan, and you're highlighted here, Hupa being the sole representative of PCA, Pacific Coast, Navajo being the sole representative of Apachean, and Dogrib being the sole representative of Canadian Athabascan. So we certainly need to expand this data set, and that's something we're working on as we go. But we at least have all the branches covered, and we do have a Yeniseian language, just one, included in this set. So that's the network approach. So this is looking at the Bayesian analysis, where we're essentially walking through a space of possible trees and attempting to find the most likely tree. So this analysis is trying to impose some tree structure on the data. Again, we're showing it in this kind of circular diagram to make it easier to fit on the screen. This is using a methodology that is maybe not the most appropriate. It's giving us a flatter tree. This is the so-called majority rules approach. This approach has been criticized because it does tend to, excuse me, it makes an assumption that there's kind of equal amount of change, equal likelihood of any particular tree within the tree space. So that may not be the best approach to look at. But if we try a different approach here,
So we really kind of, and we really clunk it.
yeah, I'll mention that on this one here, because I think this one here is a much better model here than the majority rules approach, and you see a little bit more hierarchical structure in this tree. What it's doing here, you've got some of the similar groupings that we had before, right? You've got your this is Tanana and Upper Kuskokwim here, and you've got the kind of Eastern Alaska languages down here. You've got Atna and Dene-Yenisian, kind of similar, some of the expected groupings that we would see here is the lower Yukon languages up here. So we get some of the expected things here. Got Dogrib and Navajo grouped together here, but pay attention to this number here, the 0.38. That means it's a very small proportion, or less than half of the trees we're searching are actually coming up like that. So it's not a terribly reliable figure. So, yeah. Similarly there, this 0.4 here is not a terribly reliable grouping there, placing Ket and Tlingit out there on their own branches. And we can reroute this on, did it do it? Yeah, on Tlingit. So that just swapped these two. And essentially we get no difference in the tree, right? There's just, we just still see the same sort of, the same 40% there, and the two long branches of Tlingit and Ket. The thing to notice here is, if you recall the last point that Mark was making, unlike the typological characters, the relationship between Ket and Tlingit is a little bit inconclusive here. It's not really clear, does Ket group inside Tlingit in the tree, or does it group outside Tlingit in the tree? It's not really telling us either way. It's telling us both of these languages are lexically quite different. They've differentiated quite a bit. But which one kind of diverged first isn't so clear. It's kind of a toss-up here. So it's not argument for. I think it'd be difficult to argue either way. That you certainly couldn't use this argument to say that Ket is older or has diverged more, but you couldn't say that Tlingit is older or diverged more either. So it's a bit different conclusion than we would get from the typological characters. So similarly here, this is just another way of looking at it where we can actually see the branch lengths a little better, and I know you can't read those. I apologize, but the branch length here for Tlingit, branch length for Ket. If I reroute the tree on Tlingit, I get a similar sort of result. So again, what we're seeing is that Tlingit and Ket are very different. So just to summarize some of the implications of this. So in contrast to the typological data, rather than just Tlingit being the outlier, both Tlingit and Ket are outliers. Not necessarily together, but they're just both outliers. So there's no evidence to support either being more isolated or older than the other. Did you want to do the wrap-up, or?
Doesn't matter, yeah.
Okay, so we should wrap up here. Then we have like 5 minutes left if I could just go through this. So if the DY hypothesis is valid, we find support that Yeniseian represents a back migration to Central Asia from Thuringia, right? Because if the differentiation from the typological characters shows Ket grouping inside Tlingit, then the center of gravity of these languages lies in the New World. And if the lexical characters are not telling us anything either way, then we kind of have to defer to the typological characters. The divergence then would be either after or around the same time as that of Tlingit. That is the divergence of Yeniseian. Right? So in terms of timing of things.
That's a question.
That's a question. I don't, maybe terminal plasticity. So anyway, thank you especially to Brendan and for working out the computational data, and for Margaret for entering in the lexical data. And we have a few minutes for questions.
We have time for questions, yes. Ben.
Data has some first.
Okay, just real quickly. First of all, I think Mira Rulin said at one point in time looked at Alaskan Athabascan languages as a Tlingit derivative. Is that not right, or a proto-Tlingit derivative? My question is the typological data suggest a stronger relationship with the Pacific Coast Athabascan languages? That's what I was reading out of those cluster diagrams. Is that the case?
I think that's too early to say. I mean, I don't know what you would say, Mark,
so
but if you look at the confidence level in that grouping with PCA, it's fairly low. Right? So whether it groups with PCA, with Pacific Coast, I would hesitate to make that claim. The claim I think we can support is that it groups inside Tlingit on the tree. Where in the tree is a little bit uncertain, but the certainty that it groups inside Tlingit, that is, Tlingit branches off first, seems quite clear.
That's a high certainty there.
All right. Now Ben can ask.
Could you make a statement as to what is the purpose of this when we know factually, I think we know factually, unless you're challenging that things are otherwise?
What's otherwise?
For example, we know that Tlingit is closer in every way to Athabascan than is Yeniseian.
Well, it's not in this way, though.
Not what?
It's not in this way. You said in every way, and we just showed you one way that it's not. Now, you can make what you will of that. I mean,
historically, or should we, dare I use the word factually?
Well, I would beg to differ in the sense that these are facts as well, but it's starting from different assumptions and using different data. That doesn't invalidate any sort of comparison made using, say, the comparative method or other sort of methodologies.
The cognate, isn't that cognate, the lexical, the cognate rate, or is it something else?
This isn't trying to attempt a reconstruction. This is simply looking at cognate classes.
It cognates?
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's what I mean.
The lexical.
It's the same thing. If they're cognate, then they're lexically the same. Based on a 200-word list, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Since we know, or do we, that Tlingit is closer to Athabascan than Yeniseian is.
I think when we say closer, we need a metric to define closer. And if closer is defined based on using the comparative method, then yes, I agree. And on that method, then it clearly is. But we're looking at a different methodology. And I think when we're looking at such a deep time depth, every methodology brings something to the table. Just like we want to look at archaeology, we want to look at genetics, we want to bring every sort of resource we have. One methodology doesn't discount the other. I think they're additive. They all tell us something.
It's true. Well, yeah. I mean, I mean, of course, one thing, I just wanted to bring up this slide, if I can find it. Oops, there it is. Right, is that the picture that the typological data suggests is actually very parallel to this, which Molly in 2007 had in a publication suggesting 2 back migrations out of Beringia after diversification within here. And so, so looking at other subfields, data from other subfields, the typological linguistic data has its parallels in other argumentation. And so really, one of the things we're trying to do is to just bring many more angles onto the question. And one of those is from the linguistic typology.
Yeah, and that's the other point that, if you're looking at typological characters, then it's a different.
Let's get a question in from Ben and then
Actually, Mark,
Ed.
can you scroll back to your typological map? You had a map that showed the different Canadian Alaskan groups towards the beginning, I think.
This one?
Yeah, that one. So what I find interesting, maybe we can work together. I'm looking at the maps. Line, but that reminds me of an old hypothesis by Dave Berry in the 1970s, where, around 1,500 years ago, you had a different thing happening in the southwest Yukon than in central Alaska. And his hypothesis, based on the White River ash and then people moving in after that, was that you had these Kavik-related materials without microblades first going to the Old Crow area, north, then across the Brooks Range, and then coming into Alaska. And that remarkably looks similar to your Alaska-Canada 1. Potentially, that might be an isomorphy between archaeology. And this is the kind of thing I think this is really useful to get maybe at Mike's question, is that the lexical stuff really doesn't help us with the internal variation. It's just, Athabascan is this big mush of stuff.
Yeah.
But this, I think, can help tease out more subtle differences. And I find that intriguing, and that kind of mimics the, at least one hypothesis from the archaeological data.
Yeah, and that's one thing that was, I think, both surprising given, the kind of mosh, I guess, I don't know if that's the word you said, of isoglosses that kind of go in different directions there, but that the typological patterns are actually coming out somewhat clear here.
And then one last question, can you scroll to the net, the tree for the typological?
So this one?
Yeah, so what I thought was interesting too was, we were talking earlier about how the coastal phenomenon, or the coastal, as an ecological zone, you can see it right there, that you're getting many longer range connections and many more networks that are being built up at stronger values than you see within this interior. And that's, I think, would be predicted with the kinds of resources and movement. But one thing, I know it's not meant to do this, but I wonder if you added in, because you're looking at typology, not lexical data, if you added in other coastal groups that aren't related, I think you might be able to tease apart the relationships that are simply because of the connections for for movement and for ideas, and certainly for material culture that are quite distinct from the interior. And I think that might be falsely aggregating things that are really distinct, but if we added more data, you might be able to see the connections and how they're actually working between languages we know are not related.
One of the things we'd like to do with this data set is actually expand it beyond Athabascan and bring in Eskimo Aleut and then the adjacent languages along the Pacific Northwest. So then, we could really expand the modeling and then look at other aerial relations. I mean, I think one of the nice things about both this type of method, as well as doing the work using typology, is that there's an old question in historical linguistics about trees versus waves as far as how languages change, and so rather than kind of having a kind of a bifurcated discussion there, it kind of brings both trees and waves into the same model in the sense that you see higher level phylogenetic structure, but you can also see all of this reticulation and kind of indeterminacy and contact related transfer within the network, and so it actually transcends that question and hopefully opens up new productive avenues for theorizing and using language data in the reconstruction of prehistory.
And then, if there's no question, one last thing was, I think if the data set's rich enough, you could actually then parse it into specific subsets of cognates to address, like Dave and I were talking about, this asymmetry with males and female potential relationships with value.
Yeah.
That if you then restrict your cognate or your list into specific hypothesis driven, and then run it again and again, you'll begin to see different patterns that I think would be easier to track archaeologically, and we can begin to pull some of the data and test.
Yeah, and that's easy enough to do with the methods, because you can restrict the taxa and you can restrict the characters that you're using, and then run the analysis again. So, yeah, it's productive for really testing hypotheses.